This is the third and last production in Canine Training Systems' award-winning video series about the unique substance detection training methods pioneered by Randy Hare of Jackson, Mississippi. Throughout the first two videos, we referred to the substance in question merely as the target, without specifically mentioning the identity of the substance. In order to teach the basics of searching and indication, Randy employs only one target substance throughout the dog's basic training in the box room. Once the animal has mastered the basics of searching and indication, Randy introduces the dog to the remaining odors that will comprise its repertoire of target substances. Teaching the dog to recognize a new target odor proceeds in exactly the same way that the animal was taught to recognize the original odor. The new target substance, cocaine for example, is placed in a scent box in the rack. The plexiglass windows on all of the boxes in the rack are fixed in the up position. The dog is stimulated and turned loose to search the rack. The trainer stands behind the rack, and at the moment he sees that the dog has sniffed at the cocaine box, he pops the ball down through the reward tube. The dog normally receives only 7 or 8 trials. At the end of the session, the dog is taken to the wall and allowed to make one find on a target substance he already knows. 2 training sessions are normally enough for a hair-trained dog to learn strong odor recognition of a new substance. Once the dog shows that he recognizes cocaine odor, then Randy drops the plexiglass window and begins working with the animal's final response, if necessary. Randy's goal is to ensure that the dog's final response to cocaine is every bit as powerful and comprehensive in form as the dog's final response to marijuana. Rapidly, Randy then introduces the distractions that the dog has already learned to handle in association with marijuana. The dog works search problems with odor boxes containing tennis balls, cleaning products, animal and dog odors, and every other sort of odorous substance Randy can think of. The dog practices ignoring a very wide range of gestures and sounds and sights, and his obedience to cocaine odor becomes every bit as strong as his obedience to marijuana odor, both while he is searching for odor and while he is indicating its presence. Finally, Randy arranges what he calls traps or oral bridges using the scent boxes. In these oral bridges, the cocaine hide is stuffed into the mouth of the reward tube with the reward poised atop it, so that when the dog disturbs the hide, he releases the ball into the reward chamber and self-rewards. In this way, the dog learns to indicate the presence of cocaine by deliberately mouthing it, employing what Randy calls the oral response. Because these are skills the dog has already learned in association with another substance, the dog moves exceedingly rapidly through the stages. A good dog that has sound training in the Hare method should require no more than perhaps 3 days of training and 5 or 6 training sessions to establish strong performance with a new target odor. Introduction of novel target substances proceeds more and more rapidly with each additional odor, so that by the time he is working a 4th or 5th target substance, the dog can achieve strong performance in merely a day or 2 of training with a new odor. At this point, Randy begins to vary and mix the use of the different target substances so that any odor can be featured in a given search problem. In Objective 6 of the second video of this series, we demonstrated how Randy Hare uses traps to teach the dog what he calls the oral response. Up to this point in Randy's training method, the oral response has been a self-reward process. By gripping the hide, the dog could achieve access to his reward. He did so by pulling or displacing the hide in a movement much like the movement he uses to interact with his reward. In other words, He bit and pulled at the hide, and this behavior was natural and intuitive because the hide was very, very closely associated with the reward. To bite the hide was nearly the same thing as biting the reward. Now, however, it is time to refine the oral response, to make of it a tool the dog uses deliberately to bring his handler near and make him present the reward. The process that Randy uses to teach the dog this lesson is called the oral game.
The oral game is nothing more than taking the box room to the real world and not having to take the boxes with us, because that's what it's all about. From that point on, we're not going to use the boxes as much, especially in the outside world. And we may bring him back on occasion, to sharpen them up and sharpen their skills up and teach them that they're not to trust their eyes and their ears and just their nose, just what they smell. But if we do it here in the box room, then outside in the outside world, it's much easier for the dog to understand that that's exactly what we want.
The most important feature of the oral game is that it does not involve self-reward. The reward is given from hand. The objective of the oral game is to perfect the dog's obedience to odor, so that even when the dog knows that the reward originates from the handler, he still deliberately focuses his attention on the hide and uses the oral response as his tool to manipulate the handler's behavior. The training of the oral game begins in an outdoor area. Ideally, we use a lawn or field with ankle-length grass and a light or moderate wind blowing unobstructed across the area. The handler begins by placing the hide in the middle of the area in such a way that the dog will not be able to see it until he is right on top of it. The hide can be any number of different objects, such as a PVC pipe, a metal pipe, or a canvas or nylon bag. The handler then brings the dog to a position only 10 to 15 feet from the hide and roughly downwind. He shows the dog a ball and then tucks the ball away and cues the dog to search. Even though the outdoor setting is unfamiliar, most dogs will immediately begin searching because of the well-established search cue. The dog normally catches the plume of odor drifting off of the hide with the wind and then brackets to the source. The handler follows him closely and smoothly, so that at the moment that the dog encounters the hide, the handler is immediately nearby. As a result of prior practice with the oral response, the vast majority of hair-trained dogs will immediately check the hide, poking at the hide with the nose, bumping it, or even slightly gripping at it with the teeth. The instant he sees the dog do this, the handler delivers the reward so that it falls in front of the dog's nose. If, as sometimes happens, the dog is slow to check the hide, the handler simply withholds reward for a few moments, frustrating the dog. A well-prepared animal responds to this frustration by intensifying behavior that he has previously learned. His movements toward the hide should quickly become more concerted and vigorous. The handler must watch closely and make a rapid decision, throwing the ball in the instant he sees any behavior approximating solid contact with the hide. Ideally, we want as deliberate and well-defined an oral response as possible, one that involves the dog actually gripping or mouthing the hide. But many dogs do not exhibit this mouthing response initially. Instead, they quickly establish a more or less stable head poke or acknowledgement behavior, perhaps interrupted by expectant looks at the handler. The handler must manipulate reinforcement to modify the checking or acknowledgement behavior into a true oral response. He does so first by withholding reward from the dog. The frustrated dog may look at his handler, paw at the hide, or show a number of other responses. The handler ignores these behaviors and watches for any mouthing or biting movement towards the hide, even the slightest parting of the jaws or contact with the incisors. The instant the dog exhibits some sort of oral response, the handler delivers the reward at the point of the behavior. By rewarding mouthing or biting efforts promptly, the handler should be able to rapidly shape a very deliberate and persistent oral behavior. The viewer must remember that this behavior has nothing to do with playing with the hide. The oral response is not part of the reward behavior. Instead, in the course of the oral game, mouthing becomes a deliberate instrumental behavior that the dog employs to manipulate the handler into delivering his reward coupled with fight. Biting at the hide becomes a tool, a means to an end. In some cases, the dog may show little tendency to make physical contact with the hide. This may be especially true after a few handler rewards have disrupted the dog's focus on the hide and his attention has shifted to his handler. In this case, it is very important that the handler remembers the basics of the hare method. He must not attempt to help the dog by stepping forward and pointing to the hide or moving it, because this would only interfere with the animal's self-discovery and further weaken his attention to the hide. Instead, the handler must quickly revise his expectations and identify a new target behavior for reinforcement. This behavior will vary from dog to dog and from trial to trial, but it will be some hide-directed behavior that the dog exhibits relatively easily and that the handler can shape or modify into a proper oral response. The handler's job is to catch this behavior, identify it instantly, and then reinforce it a split second after it occurs. For instance, the handler may reward the dog for merely looking at or moving towards the hide. Once this response stabilizes, then the handler raises the stakes once again by withholding reward for a moment. When the dog makes a more vigorous approach to the hide, perhaps placing his nose near it or even lightly contacting it, the handler rewards him. Subsequently, the handler demands some tiny movement involving the dog's jaws or incisor teeth before delivering reward. In this way, the handler successively asks for a more and more distinctive checking or acknowledgement response. On the other hand, there are some dogs that will carry the oral response too far. They pick the hide up and begin carrying it. In this case, Randy makes a hide consisting of heavy steel pipe. The vast majority of dogs will not pick up such a pipe or attempt to play with it, but they will contact it or check it. The handler's job is to instantly reward a clear bump or check. Once these dogs have learned that bumping, mouthing, or checking the metal hide will earn their reward, their impulse to play with the hide should quickly weaken. As the training proceeds, the handler begins sending the dog further out into the field to find the hide. He hangs back and expects the dog to make the oral response at a greater distance. When the dog bumps, acknowledges, or bites strongly, then the handler comes closer. Each time the dog bumps, the handler moves quickly forward, letting the dog know that through this behavior, he brought reward closer. Once the handler moves up close, he rewards the dog after a particularly strong interaction with the hide. Now, in the hare method, the dog knows and understands that his reward is with and delivered from his handler. Consequently, the visual cues of the handler may begin to compete with the hide for the dog's attention. That is, the animal may find it difficult to maintain his concentration on the hide while his handler creeps closer, because he anticipates delivering of the ball at any moment. The dog may lift his head and look at the handler expectantly, or even move a little to face the handler. If he does so, then the handler merely pauses and watches him. He waits for the animal to redirect his attention to the hide. Then he instantly confirms the offered behavior by moving quickly closer. If the dog is so distracted that he actually moves away from the hide, then the handler quickly moves away from the dog and the hide. This move punishes incorrect performance by signaling to the dog that reward has become less imminent. It also facilitates the dog's attention to the hide by putting more distance between him and the handler, so that the handler does not compete so strongly with the hide for his attention. Once the dog reestablishes focus on the hide and begins to acknowledge and bump, then the handler lets him know that this is the correct course of action by moving closer and eventually delivering the reward.
The oral game is nothing more than ensuring that the dog is going to be accurate, or as close to being accurate as he possibly can. It is, in its purest sense, nothing more than the dog understanding that you have the reward, you have secured the reward, and there's only one way, one avenue for him to obtain that reward back. He has to localize the odor, follow it to its source, and indicate on it in an oral manner in order to obtain his reward. And we're very clear about that. We want to fulfill our end of the contract once the dog fulfills his end, and both of us are very clear as to what that avenue is.
With practice, the dog's focus on the hide will become strong. So strong that the dog becomes utterly obedient to odor, acknowledging and bumping the hide again and again, challenging his attention to the odor source, even though he knows the reward will actually come from the handler. In the next elaboration of the oral game, Randy puts obstacles in the dog's path. He creates puzzles for the dog to solve in his efforts to reach the hide and emit the oral response. These puzzles take as many forms as the handler has imagination and ingenuity for. However, Randy most often begins with a purpose-built wooden box. To begin with, the dog is allowed to find the hide in the box once or twice with the lid open so that he realizes that the target is in the box and that the oral response is still possible. Next, the lid of the wooden box is closed, but it is held slightly ajar by a screw or some similar device so that a vigorous head poke or sniff will lift the lid. In this way, the dog is able to flip the lid open with his nose, gain access to the hide, and then emit the oral response. This is the first situation in which the dog learns that even when his access to the hide is blocked, with persistence and effort, he may be able to work his way through the obstacle and win the opportunity to make the oral response. In a similar exercise, the hide is placed under a brick or similar heavy object. The dog must shove or move this object out of the way in order to reach the hide. When the animal becomes sufficiently determined and stubborn to shift a heavy object in the course of reaching the hide, then we know that when he encounters a hide in the course of an operational search, he will stop at nearly nothing in order to reach it. This determination will make the animal exceedingly easy to read. It will make him pinpoint precisely, and it will substantially delay the final response as he investigates the hide. The handler will therefore have abundant opportunity to learn the exact location of the hide and intervene to prevent the aggressive final response if necessary. Puzzles are strategically placed hides designed to allow the dog to utilize all of the components in his final response, which he has learned ultimately speed reward delivery from the handler. Sometimes Randy employs a cardboard box in which he places the hide. This puzzle can be especially useful with dogs that do not show enough intensity in their alert, their change of behavior to odor. Initially, the top of the box is left open so that the dog can push his way inside and emit the final response. On subsequent trials, the box is closed progressively more tightly so that the dog must use his feet or his muzzle in order to pry the box open and gain access to the hide. Finally, the box is closed very tightly and the dog is allowed to shred or tear the box open in order to get to the hide and make the oral response. Randy allows a dog to destroy a cardboard box only 1 or 2 times. This is all that is necessary to increase intensity and persistence. In addition, if the dog is allowed to destroy too many boxes, there is always the risk that he will begin to regard the opportunity to destroy the box as the goal of searching. Overuse of cardboard boxes can result in a dog that short-circuits, breaking off a search to begin biting and tearing at soft objects he encounters. Randy's ultimate puzzle involves distractors. Now, the objects that hinder the dog's access to the hide are not merely neutral surfaces or barriers. Instead, they are objects that have value for the dog. Randy places a hide in the bottom of a box and sets the box out on the ground. In addition to the hide, the box may also contain tennis balls or other reward objects. By this point in his training, the dog is extensively desensitized to stray tennis balls encountered in the course of search problems, so normally he is not fixated on the balls. He may exhibit some interest in the balls at first, but then he should go straight to the hide and make the oral response for his reward. As the exercise develops, Randy loads the box with more and more balls until eventually the animal scents the hide through a thick layer of distracting tennis balls, works his way past all of these distractors, and makes a solid oral response. Such a demonstration is unique to the hair-trained detector dog and shows in an utterly convincing way that the dog's comprehension of his task is crystal clear. This demonstrates clearly the dog's understanding that reward without fight is as meaningless as the odor of the other balls. In Randy's opinion, the best way for a dog to negotiate any new detection problem, like vehicle searches, is for him to work utterly independently, with minimal influence from his handler. Ideally, the handler's role is to cue the dog to search and then stay out of his way until he completes the search and gains his reward. In order to minimize the handler's involvement, Randy makes use of the oral game. The trap is set in a relatively open location on the vehicle, such as on top of a wheel. The vehicle is parked in an area with unrestricted, gentle airflow, and the hide is placed on the downwind side of the car. The dog is turned loose downwind of the vehicle and to one side of the scent plume originating from the hide. Once he encounters the scent flowing downwind from the hide, he will bracket his way upwind. If the dog is well prepared, no further intervention of the handler should be necessary to bring the animal to his reward. Further hides are then set on the downwind side of the vehicle, still in rather exposed locations where the dog can easily locate the hide with an oral response. Such locations include behind the rear view mirror, inside the wheel wells, in the gas filler with the door open so the dog can access the hide, and on top of the bumpers. With additional practice, the hide can be placed more deeply in the car, for instance, under the body and rocker panels and under the bumpers. Before long, the dog will be ready for placements that can be reached only from the upwind side of the car. These initial upwind placements should be somewhat straightforward and exposed, such as on top of the wheels. Expect the dog to spend considerable time on the downwind side of the car because when he takes the initiative to circle the car, his first movements will take him out of odor, and he will tend to return again and again to the downwind side of the car where he finds plentiful scent. Eventually, he will learn to circle the obstacle when he is prevented from reaching source from downwind, even when his maneuver seems to take him out of the scent plume. As a rule, Randy arranges the vast majority of the finds on cars in that zone of the car from the tops of the doors down. Most operational finds will occur in this lower zone of the vehicle because most suitable hiding places are in the vehicle's chassis, engine compartment, gas tank, or lower parts of the car body. Moreover, on the occasion when hides or real-world targets are placed higher in the vehicle's body, this should pose no problem because the odor will normally diffuse down to an area where the dog can catch it. The critical viewer may be concerned that the dog has not yet learned a systematic pattern for searching a car. He may neglect to circle the car. He may be reluctant to move to the upwind side of the car, and he may repeatedly search areas that he has already cleared. In Randy's opinion, none of this is important at this stage. Randy's strategy is to first establish in the dog powerful confidence and independence, relying on him to trust himself and his abilities. Only once this is done does Randy teach the animal that he should also follow a search pattern that his handler sets for him. This is the last skill for the dog to learn, and in the hair system, it is utterly subordinate to independent search. Once the dog has become adept at scouring the outside and underside of a vehicle and using the oral response to reward himself, then for the first time, Randy embeds the hide in the car so that the dog cannot reach it. Instead, the animal must use the final response to indicate the presence of the target. To produce this result, Randy may place the hide in the gas filler with the door closed, in the jamb of one of the doors, or inside the tail light housing. Randy refers to this type of problem as a blocked hide. A hide may be totally blocked, meaning that the dog is never allowed to make contact with the hide, and he is rewarded for the final response by receiving the ball from his trainer's hand with a fight. Hides may also be partially blocked, so that the dog is compelled to make the final response. But then the handler has a means to unblock the hide for the dog so that he can make the oral response. If we define all of the possible alternatives, then we find that Randy has 4 possible types of hides that he can set in a vehicle. First, Randy can set an open trap in which the hide is physically accessible so the dog can make the oral response. Because the hide is attached to a tennis ball, the oral response results in self-reward. Open traps have the advantage that they increase the dog's expectation of making the oral response rather than the final response, and they do not involve rewarding the dog from hand.
It's important to realize that absolutely no part of this technique has to do with fooling the dog. It's very straightforward. He knows where the reward is and knows how it's going to be delivered. However, when we incorporate a trap like this, the reason for the trap is to get it across to the dog that if we're going to a new environment, we're going to vehicle searches, we're going to room searches, it's to have an event happen at the moment the dog interacts with the substance itself. The idea is for him to grab this, interact with it, and then the reward appears. In fact, most of them you'll see actually ignore the reward and wait for you to bring the one that actually involves a fight, because the fight truly is the reward in this matter.
Randy can also set an open aid hide, in which the hide is placed in an accessible location, and when the dog finds it and makes the oral response, the handler rewards him. This method has the advantage that the dog does have the opportunity to execute the oral response. Randy can also use a partially blocked hide, in which the target is inaccessible to the dog, but when he finds it and indicates it by using the final response, the handler then unblocks the hide for the dog. Once the animal executes the oral response on the now accessible hide, then the handler rewards him from hand. This method has the advantage that the hide can be buried in the car where the animal cannot see it and where it is more difficult to scent. And although the dog has the opportunity to practice using the final response, in the end, he is rewarded for the oral response. These hides are typically set up as puzzles and are included in the 80% portion of the 80-20 ratio of executable oral to delivered reward. Finally, Randy can also set a totally blocked hide for the dog. In a blocked hide, the target substance is secreted in some place in the car that the dog cannot reach and gain access. After detecting the aid and localizing it to the extent that it is possible, the dog, in an attempt to solve the puzzle and make an oral response, will offer his final response, at which time the handler rewards the dog with a fight. Totally blocked hides are absolutely necessary to the dog's training. Only by using totally blocked hides can the handler prepare his dog for the challenges of real-world searches in which the target will be buried deep within the vehicle's body, wheels, or engine compartment. However, totally blocked aids are problematic because they feature a critical disadvantage. The totally blocked hide allows the dog to execute only the final response. Because he receives his reward without having to resort to the oral response, his preference for the oral response over the final response is very slightly degraded. Over time, if we reward the dog again and again for the final response rather than the oral response, the dog will spend less and less time alerting on a hide and trying to find a way to contact it. He will resort more and more quickly to the final response. As a result, we may find the dog's final response migrating away from the hide. He may begin responding on some convenient surface when he first encounters traces of target odor. Even if this is not the closest possible point to the hide, the dog's obedience to odor may ultimately become so degraded that he tends to false alarm on any handy surface whether he has detected target odor or not. Randy prevents blocked aid practice from degrading the dog's focus on the hide by using the 20%-80% formula introduced in tape 2 of this series. Randy sets a completely blocked aid for the dog only about one time in 5 searches, or 20% of the time. When the dog encounters a blocked hide, and after realizing that he cannot reach the hide, the animal will carry out the final response and receive his reward from the handler with a fight. Fully 4 times out of 5, or 80% of the time, the hide is arranged in such a way that the dog will be able to make the oral response. This means an open trap, an open hide, or a partially blocked hide constructed as a puzzle. In the case of open traps, the dog self-rewards. The power of open traps lie in that the dog can work independently on hides that are suspended in mid-air, sharpening their skills on high hides without the handler disturbing air currents or drafts. Randy's second means of preserving the dog's obedience to odor is simply good technique when rewarding from hand. Good technique ensures that the ball rewards the dog for concentration on odor and solid responding rather than handler-directed behavior and weak responding. Once the dog alerts on odor, pinpoints it, and begins to respond, the handler should move into a strategic position where reward can be offered. He must not praise or encourage the dog. Praising and encouraging the dog does nothing to sharpen the animal's understanding of his task, and because it draws the dog's attention to his handler, tends to weaken his final response rather than strengthen it. Once he is in position, the handler waits for the moment in which the animal exhibits the behavior that he desires. The handler must have a clear conception of the final response he is looking for from the dog. He must instantly recognize the head poke or foot scratch or bite he wishes to reward. And he must deliver the reward accurately so that it arrives at the closest point to the source of odor. If the handler masters these skills, then he will be able to reward the dog from hand with a minimum of disruption of the dog's focus on target odor.
Good move.
Randy prefers to introduce the dog to indoor searches relatively late in training because the unpredictable and complex currents of air inside buildings pose a more difficult set of problems for localization than the relatively straightforward scent picture available in an open area. The first step is to simply make the dog aware that search problems and rewards are available in unfamiliar buildings. This is easily done simply by throwing a hide out on the floor of a building and playing the oral game with the dog. The dog will need only 1 or 2 oral games to realize that a building interior is as valid a search area as an outdoor area. Then the hide can be placed in concealed locations to force the animal to search with his nose. As always in the hare method, this first introduction to a new search skill must be performed off-leash and without the slightest input or help from the handler. The initial hides are all traps and placed in a relatively small and clear room, with all ventilation and AC systems turned off. The hide is placed on the wall or close to it with a tennis ball or other preferred reward attached with the proper length of cord so that it is concealed and not in immediate proximity to the hide. The hide itself must be low enough so that the dog can relatively easily reach it, but it should not be easily visible. The dog is given the cue to search and then turned loose in this search space. Through manipulations like these, the dog learned that reward odor does not necessarily predict reward. Only target odor reliably predicts reward. This is demonstrated easily enough when we randomly place extra tennis balls in the indoor search areas and the dog ignores them in his search for odor. As the dog's experience increases, then Randy makes the traps more and more difficult. For instance, in the search problem shown here, the trap has been moved to a location that is more obstructed and the hide itself has been raised. When the dog has worked out a number of different trap problems and demonstrated the ability to stubbornly follow his nose to the source of the target odor, he is ready for his first trap problem of substantial difficulty. We can increase the difficulty of a search problem in any number of ways. We can increase the height of the hide so that the dog must rear up or even leap in order to contact it. We can conceal or cover the hide so that the dog must pass a barrier in order to emit the oral response. We can also pose additional difficulties for the dog by way of more complex and crowded environments. Such environments disperse and channel target odor in unpredictable ways. In addition, the obstacles in a crowded environment will sometimes trap the dog in an area that is misleading or unproductive of odor. Perhaps the most difficult type of trap problem features a hide hanging from the ceiling in the middle of an area because the odor plume produced by such a trap, especially when forced air ventilation or climate control systems are running, is unpredictable and difficult, perhaps leading the dog to the opposite end of the room from the trap. Success in training the dog to carry out these independent searches relies on the trainer's ability to accurately predict the animal's capability. The trainer must pose for the dog a problem that is challenging, but that is also within the animal's scope. In the event that we have miscalculated the dog's ability and the dog cannot find the hide within a reasonable period, the handler must resist the temptation to step in and help. Randy stresses that there is nothing, absolutely nothing so destructive to the progress of a detector dog than learning that when he is in difficulty, his handler will help him to find the hide. If a problem does go wrong, if after intensive efforts the animal begins to show discouragement, as a last resort, the handler should pick the dog up and praise him. The handler then intervenes by changing the dynamic of the problem to ensure the dog can earn success with less challenge to his skill level. Once the dog has received a thorough introduction to indoor searches using open traps, then Randy begins to incorporate all of the other varieties of possible finds: open hides, partially blocked hides, and totally blocked hides. When planning each day's work, Randy carefully manipulates the schedule of oral responses and final responses to meet the 20%, 80% criterion. To this point in training, the handler has exerted very, very little control or influence on the dog during searches. This is an essential part of the hare method. As a result, the dog has become extremely self-reliant and even insensitive to his handler. Ultimately, however, we must begin to bring the search under the handler's control. We must do so without hampering the dog's independence and without teaching him to rely upon his handler to make the find. The ability to take cues and presentations from his handler to allow his handler to sometimes dictate the pace and the pattern of the search is the last lesson for the substance detector dog to learn. The process begins with the handler holding the dog's leash while he searches. Randy normally chooses a relatively small area in which to practice this skill, or a larger area that is cluttered with objects that slow the dog down so the handler can keep up without impeding the dog's progress. The dog is allowed to search as he is accustomed, at his own pace and using his own pattern, responding to air currents and odor according to his impulse. The leash should be held high and slack. The handler makes no attempt to control or guide him. He merely moves close to the dog and lets him feel the leash from time to time to begin the work of habituating him to his handler's immediate presence. Next, the handler begins to move in front of the dog as he searches, accustoming the dog to the presence of his handler so close and walking backwards, even bumping into obstacles and stumbling as handlers often do. Once the dog shows he is untroubled and undistracted by his handler's presence, then the handler begins to teach the dog to follow presentations. Presentations are hand gestures designed to draw the dog's attention to particular features or areas of the search substrate. Randy does not teach the dog to accept presentations by compelling the dog to be obedient during the search. He does not use leash corrections or harsh commands to force the dog to pay attention to him and obediently search as he is told. Such a procedure would be antithetical to everything Randy has created in the course of the dog's education. Instead, Randy approaches presentations from the perspective that now, for the first time, the handler will, on occasion, become a source of useful information to the dog. Randy waits for a moment when the dog is searching a few feet away from the aid, and then he presents an area near the hide, attracting the dog's attention by pointing or tapping at that area. When the dog sniffs in this area, he catches the odor of the aid, and then works the odor to source. Several times over the course of the next few searches, Randy employs this same procedure, attracting the dog's attention to some productive area where he detects odor and then makes his way to source. The dog very quickly learns that the handler is a source of useful information, and that when the handler points something out, it is worth the trouble of investigating it, because this presentation is likely to lead him to odor. Once the dog willingly takes presentations, then Randy begins to mix things up. He is careful not to point out the location of odor too often, and he will often make presentations in areas that are not productive or do not lead the dog to odor. In addition, Randy never demands that the dog work in complete obedience to the handler. Searching is not an exercise in obedience. It is an exercise in self-reliance and persistence. Nothing is to be gained from pressuring the dog into total obedience when he searches, and very much can be lost. Ideally, a high-performance substance detection dog is an independent search instrument capable of working intensively without handler direction. However, sometimes it will be necessary for the handler to control the dog's search pattern, as when the animal is neglecting a potentially productive area of the search area, or when the handler knows the dog has detected odor that has been transported from one area or room to another by drafts or by forced air ventilation. In this case, the dog must be obedient to his handler and leave one area and search another on cue. Randy stresses that it is very important not to attempt to force the dog to search in an area he has little interest in. It is not effective or practical to use the leash or harsh commands to induce the dog to search an area he is neglecting. Instead, Randy always keeps in mind the dog's momentary motivation. In the course of the search, from moment to moment, what the dog wants is to make progress, to cover ground, because he knows that as he proceeds, he comes closer to odor and ultimately to reward. This supplies a fund of positive motivation that Randy can use to reward the animal for accepting presentations, for accepting guidance in the course of the search. For example, if the handler wants the dog to investigate an object in a corner, and the dog instead wants to impatiently duck to his handler's left and move on to another area of the room, Randy makes no attempt to pull the dog back into the corner. He merely uses the leash to restrict the dog each time he tries to make progress in the wrong direction. In essence, he refuses to follow the dog's lead and instead waits patiently, beckoning the animal to search the corner and restricting him with the leash each time he tries to duck past. Finally, the dog will give up and follow the presentation, and at this moment the handler gives him praise and then moves out of the corner, allowing the dog to make progress. The dog will soon learn that if his handler asks for his attention or asks him to follow a presentation, the search will not proceed any further until he accepts the presentation. In addition, because this presentation will sometimes lead the dog directly into odor and a find, he will quickly learn to allow his handler to influence his search pattern. The dominant type of substance detector is the active or aggressive response dog, used very commonly for narcotics interdiction. The passive response detection dog, normally used for explosives detection, indicates odor in a different manner. Most accounts characterize the passive detection response in terms of position. They describe the dog as sitting or lying down in response to odor. However, Randy conceptualizes the passive response differently than other trainers. The passive response is not a position. It is not a sit or a down. The passive response is a particular way of interacting with the hide in which the dog employs stillness or close acknowledgement in order to make his indication. In fact, having the dog assume a particular position is the farthest thing from Randy's mind. Instead, he teaches the dog to interact with the hide by first making contact with his nose. In Randy's opinion, this is all that is necessary. A well-developed contact response is more than sufficient for the dog to indicate his find clearly. Randy teaches the passive response dog to assume a sit or down only if such an indication is required by an agency policy or custom. If such an indication is dictated, then Randy teaches the dog to sit only very, very late in training, when the contact or acknowledgement response is very well developed and the dog's tendency to pinpoint the aid is very strong. Randy's method for training the passive response dog closely parallels his method for training the aggressive dog. Therefore, in this section, we will refer to the training objectives presented in tapes 1, 2, and 3 of this series, reviewing each of them briefly and then explaining how these procedures are modified to produce a passive indication response. The hair method of training detector dogs is very powerful, and as a result, Randy can normally teach just about any type of high-quality dog to indicate odor with a passive response. However, dogs differ greatly in their individual characteristics and learning styles. What is easy for one dog to learn may be more difficult for another. In consideration of the length of searches, difficulty of environments, distractors, and other factors an employed detector dog will inevitably encounter, it should be realized that drive level and stability are foremost. Regardless of indication style, the ingredients that make a successful passive detector dog in the hare method differ little from those of an aggressive alert dog. Randy points out that what we reinforce in a high-drive dog's training is what the dog will exhibit to obtain reward, and with this in mind, his test varies little. Therefore, when selecting a dog for passive response training, Randy will look for a dog that will stare or freeze when exposed to reward behind a barrier as long as it isn't indicative of decrease in drive, lack of intensity, or distractibility. If this indicator of an individual dog's character doesn't present itself, a dog of high drive, calm resting state with little nervous energy will perform equally well so long as it has what Randy refers to as game and shows all other attributes required for detection work. Just as with the aggressive response dog, training begins with teaching the dog to investigate scent boxes in the short rack. The target box is used with the plexiglass window up. In this configuration, the dog is not presented with a convenient substrate on which to scratch. Instead, he encounters a cavity that tends to elicit head poking and investigation responses instead. The trainer attracts the dog to the boxes by stimulating him with the sight of a tennis ball being bounced in the reward chamber of the target box. The dog is rewarded once or twice simply for running to the scent box and thrusting his head and muzzle into the reward chamber. On the third or fourth trial, the trainer withholds the ball for a few moments after the dog reaches the target box. The dog's expectation of receiving the ball will be frustrated, and puzzled, he will begin to search. A dog with high detector aptitude will search by sniffing, and in the process, he will draw in the odor of the target substance in the target chamber. When, an instant later, the trainer drops the ball through the reward tube, the animal will begin to form a strong mental association between target odor and the ball. After just one or two training sessions, Randy begins shifting the target box randomly about in the rack so that the dog must search for the odor rather than simply running to the box where he last saw the ball. At this point, when the dog is surprised by encountering target odor in an unexpected location, he will give us the first evidence of strong odor recognition by showing us his first strong original response to odor. The original response will be a head snap, a tensing of the body, or some other behavior that tells us unmistakably that the animal has learned that target odor predicts the appearance of the ball. With many dogs, however, the original response will also involve more aggressive behaviors. This is why when training a passive alert detector dog, Randy is careful to deliver the reward very, very quickly, just after the animal notices target odor. His goal is to prevent any clawing or scratching behavior. He wants to develop a very strong odor-reward association while minimizing the dog's opportunity to practice aggressive behavior. Once the dog shows a powerful original response when he hits odor, Randy imposes an instrumental requirement. He begins teaching the animal that the ball is no longer automatically available when target odor is present. Instead, the ball must be earned with a particular behavior. The desired behavior is not a specific position like sitting or lying down. The dog must deliberately freeze when he pinpoints odor. Initially, this freezing is not the product of the instrumental reward. It is not a deliberate behavior. It is a component of the dog's original response. It is a simple consequence of the Pavlovian association the dog has formed between target odor and reward. This is because through conditioning, the odor begins to trigger the same physical responses that the ball triggers. Thus, the dog begins to tense all the muscles in his body when he smells odor, in preparation to lunge at the ball. If the ball does not appear as quickly as the animal expects, this preparatory tensing lends itself easily to a freezing or pointing behavior. Like a hound at the entrance of a rabbit warren, the dog will stare, poised for action, waiting for his quarry to appear. It is upon this involuntary component of the dog's original response that Randy Hare builds the dog's deliberate passive final response. He does this by using instrumental reward to capture the freezing component of the original response. Randy times the reward very precisely so as to reinforce the instant of immobility that the dog exhibits when he reacts to target odor. With most dogs, Randy will have only 1 or 2 moments to get the reward in before the dog realizes that the quarry will not appear and mobilizes more aggressive behavior in the effort to secure the quarry. Now, if the trainer misses this moment, if he is too slow to catch and reward the freeze, then the dog may launch into a full-blown aggressive indication. In this case, the trainer has no choice but to wait the dog out, wading through all biting, scratching, or clawing until the frustrated animal freezes again. If the dog instead becomes discouraged and leaves the box, then the handler comes forward and takes the leash. The trainer teases the dog and the exercise begins again. Once the frustrated dog freezes again, then Randy delivers the reward through the reward tube. A similar approach is taken with the dog that does not exhibit the initial moment of immobility, but instead falls instantly to clawing and tearing at the box. Randy waits the animal out, punishing all these aggressive behaviors by withholding reward, until the puzzled animal comes to a stop, and then he presents the reward. If the handler successfully resists the temptation to interfere with and physically control the dog, then this method of self-discovery will yield very rapid results. Because he has no external inputs, the dog is free to intently monitor his own actions and to associate with those actions any rewards or punishments that come his way. He will quickly learn to inhibit his aggressive tendencies and wait for the ball to appear instead. Once the dog begins to exhibit a good freeze, then Randy uses this freezing as the platform for the full final response. An effective passive detector dog does not merely freeze when he smells odor. In Randy Hare's book, the passive detector dog's job is to indicate clearly the presence of odor and then approach it, pinpoint the source, and make contact with or close acknowledgement of the target substance. Some dogs will naturally approach very close to the source of odor, inserting their noses into the reward chamber as they freeze. In this case, it is very easy to capture the contact component by providing reward the instant after the contact occurs. If the dog instead freezes with his nose and head some distance away from the hide, Randy shapes him to approach. He does this, as always, by withholding reward for a few moments after the dog freezes. As the dog becomes frustrated, he will show some tiny sign of impatience by stepping towards the box, leaning at it, or even by merely advancing his nose ever so slightly towards the reward chamber. At this moment, Randy rewards him. If the dog then makes contact with the reward tube or the reward chamber after approaching, then this is ideal, allowing Randy to reinforce a passive final response in which all of the critical elements are present: close approach to the source, contact, acknowledgement, and tonic freezing. However, most often the student detector dog will offer the first 2 elements easily, but contact will not be as easy to develop. Randy initially attempts to elicit contact simply by withholding reward. If frustration quickly leads the dog to acknowledge or bump the box, then he is rewarded. However, the transition from freezing and staring to contact can sometimes be difficult. In response to frustration, the dog may begin aggressive responding with his feet, or he may become discouraged and leave the box, or he may do first one and then the other, without ever providing the trainer with a moment of contact that can be reinforced. For such dogs, Randy has a trick. He lowers the plexiglass door of the reward chamber a few inches, not enough to bar the dog's access to the chamber, but enough so that as he inserts his nose to approach the hide, he must push against or strongly contact the window. This affords Randy with a pushing or contact response he can reward and build upon. To repeat an important point, Randy does not care in what position the dog freezes, sitting, lying down, or standing. As Randy teaches it, the passive response is not a particular position. It is a repeated or prolonged contact or acknowledgement response. Randy teaches the passive alert dog to divert his attention away from the ball in exactly the same way he teaches the aggressive dog to do so. He begins by attracting the dog to the decoy box with the visual cues of the ball being bounced about in the reward chamber. He helps the dog learn to disengage from the decoy box by withdrawing the ball from the box before the dog arrives. Once the dog easily leaves this box, Randy goes one step further by leaving the ball in the box. He discourages any responding to the ball by the simple expedient of holding reward. Only when the dog leaves the ball in the decoy box and finds the target odor and responds properly does he gain reward. In this way, the student detector dog learns to distrust and ignore the visual and olfactory cues of an active ball. Similarly, the dog learns to bypass a ball that is bounced on the floor near him when he is making his passive indication. Because the passive response gives the dog little outlet for his energy, because it does not consume and occupy the dog the way the aggressive response does, the passive dog is more easily distractible during his final response. As a result, obedience to odor must be built more carefully and slowly with the passive dog. The ball is introduced further from the dog, and he is given much successful practice to establish his resistance to distraction. Similarly, more care and more steps are used to teach the passive dog to ignore the ball while searching. Only when his attention to the search remains undisrupted by a ball bounced once at distance is the ball brought slightly closer, and so forth. As the last step in this progression, the dog learns to treat the presentation of the ball by the handler as a command, a cue that both brings him into drive and also promises him that if he begins to search, he will find the origin of target odor and then be presented with reward. As we saw in tapes 2 and 3 of this series, the linchpin of the hare method of training detection dogs is what Randy calls the oral response. The oral response is what encourages the hare-trained dog to delay his final response in favor of exhaustive and intensive efforts to localize and grip the target. When training a passive alert detection dog, the analog to the aggressive dog's oral response is a contact or acknowledgement response. Rather than teaching the dog to grip or grasp the target, Randy teaches the passive dog to place his nose on or at the target. Recall that the dog has already learned to contact the scent box in one way or another. This contact is a different issue. Here, Randy is teaching the dog to specifically search out and contact the hide. The scent box is arranged with the plexiglass window in the open position, and a hide is placed in the reward chamber where the dog has access to it. In order to discourage gripping and biting, Randy tends to use packaging like PVC or metal pipe rather than a canvas bag. The behaviors that dogs show on their first trial with an exposed hide differ greatly. Some dogs make nose contact with the hide quite naturally, but some bite at the hide. Some dogs scratch. However, at this point in training, all hare-trained passive detector dogs have learned to make contact or closely acknowledge for reward, usually with the plexiglass window or the floor of the reward chamber. In addition, they have learned to be very active students. They have learned to experiment with their own behavior. As a result, by this point in training, if the dog does not immediately offer a contact response to the hide, Randy feels confident in simply waiting the dog out. It is through non-reward of incorrect responses that the dog learns that those responses are not successful. The most important thing is to resist the temptation to help the dog in some way by encouraging or correcting. Instead, Randy insists we must watch the animal and reinforce him the instant that he exhibits a contact or close acknowledgement response. After just a few trials, the dog will make contact readily, and then Randy begins teaching the dog to be stubborn. He withholds reward after the first contact and asks for a second before he rewards the dog. Then he refuses to reward the second and asks for a third, and so forth, until the dog stubbornly stays at the scent box, repeatedly contacting the hide until the reward is presented. A very few dogs naturally learn a prolonged contact response, in which they place their noses in contact with the hide and wait there until rewarded. This behavior is ideal, but unnecessary. Such dogs are in the minority. Most animals learn a pattern of repeated light contacts or obvious acknowledgments, and for Randy's purposes, this behavior is perfectly satisfactory. The passive dog learns to extend his search beyond the confines of the short rack in the same manner as the aggressive dog. Randy simply places the hide in scent boxes nearby to the short rack and waits, relying on the dog's independent search and his obedience to odor to take him to it. Once the dog has learned that the hide may be in any box in the room, then Randy begins to place the hide between boxes and on top of boxes, and then in locations distinct from boxes. The dog's behavior when encountering hides in the open may be somewhat aggressive. He may bite the hide and pull it out or dislodge it. Randy tries to discourage aggression by careful hide placement or hide containers that will discourage active responses. If we have miscalculated the placement and the dog bites or dislodges the aid, this is not ideal, but it is not something to be excessively concerned about. Randy rewards the dog anyway and tries to make a better placement for the next problem. Of course, once we make placements outside of scent boxes, then we must begin to give the dog rewards from hand, delivering the ball at the point of odor when he makes contact with the open hide. The transition to rewards from hand must be managed with slightly more care with the passive detector dog than with the aggressive dog. Rewards from hand were introduced in the course of the oral game, and the main purpose of the oral game was to educate the dog that he manipulates the handler to his location where the handler delivers reward. Therefore, with the passive dog, we are doubly challenged. We cannot use puzzles to provide the dog with the ability to use final response behaviors to solve puzzles, which strengthen his responding. In addition, because the passive dog does not have the outlet of aggressive responding, his concentration and obedience to odor are more easily disrupted than the aggressive dog's. Our first safeguard is precise timing. The reward must arrive at the exact moment when the dog's attention is on the hide. If, in spite of our best efforts, the dog begins to look towards his handler after one or two rewards from hand, then Randy waits him out patiently until he reestablishes his focus. If, in the rare case, the dog is seriously distracted and does not reestablish focus in response to frustration, then Randy will have the handler pull him away. The dog will then be re-stimulated with the ball and given another chance to perform correctly for reward. The most important thing, Randy insists, is not to reward the dog unless he is exhibiting the desired behavior. A well-prepared and well-motivated dog will sooner or later return to the strategy that has won him success on previous occasions. Now, as with the aggressive dog's oral response, it is essential to give the passive dog's contact response priority and primacy over the final response. To make the dog strongly prefer the contact or acknowledgement response and use it as his default method of indicating a hide. Randy gives the contact response primacy for the passive dog by arranging about 80% of the dog's search problems in such a way that the dog can reach the hide and make contact. Because making contact is the dog's most frequent method of resolving the search and gaining his objective, the dog expects it. He anticipates making contact so strongly that he tries for prolonged periods to gain access to the hide. It is only when he has demonstrated it to himself that the aid is not accessible that he will resort to his final response. As the viewer knows, one of the most powerful aspects of Randy Hare's training method is his treatment of distractors. With respect to teaching the dog to ignore simple distractors and concomitant cues, there is no difference between Randy's method for passive and aggressive dogs. Likewise, the passive dog is taught additional odors in the same fashion as the aggressive dog, by going back to scent boxes and experiencing pure Pavlovian odor-reward pairings, with no requirement for a final response or a contact response. A few minutes ago, we referred to the main challenges of training the passive detector dog. The passive dog does not have a powerful final response to give him an outlet for his drive. Therefore, his performance may be more disrupted by hand rewards than the aggressive dogs. In addition, he cannot use the oral response combined with a tap to give the passive dog a way to self-reward. Therefore, we must make the transition to rewarding from hand earlier than with the aggressive dog. That is, as soon as we present hides outside of scent boxes. The contact game is one of the main techniques that Randy uses to keep hand responses from degrading the dog's final response. The contact game is exactly analogous to the oral game, except that the behavior that the dog uses to draw the handler closer and bring reward is repeated contact or acknowledgement. The viewer should consult the material for teaching Objective 10 and follow these methods closely with the passive detector dog. Be aware, however, that the passive dog may begin mouthing or biting the hide. This is entirely to be expected and nothing to be excessively concerned about. The handler should simply ignore the mouthing response and use timely rewards to reinforce contact or acknowledgement. In addition, it is often helpful to package the hide in metal pipe and to make the hide heavy enough so that it does not readily move when the dog contacts it. Both of these factors will encourage the dog not to bite, but to deliberately touch or acknowledge the hide. As we have seen, Randy makes extensive use of puzzles and problems of access to the hide with aggressive response dogs. These puzzles and problems teach the dog that through persistent investigation, he may be able to penetrate past all sorts of barriers and find a way to exploit his preferred response, the oral response. This persistence on the dog's part intensifies his localization response and also helps to inhibit false responding. One respect in which Randy's handling of passive and active dogs differs is that Randy limits the use of puzzles and problems with passive dogs. Puzzles normally involve some sort of barrier or screen that the dog physically and aggressively penetrates in order to earn the chance to emit the oral response. If we place such barriers in the way of a passive dog, they will encourage him to use his feet and begin responding much more aggressively. What is a suitable puzzle for a passive detector dog varies from animal to animal, depending on the strength of their aggressive tendencies. In general, the puzzle should always offer a path to the hide. The path may be restricted or screened with very light objects, but the dog should always be able to push through relatively easily with his head and muzzle and contact the hide. The puzzle should not be totally closed, like a cardboard box with all flaps tightly shut, because these puzzles force the dog to either use the final response, which is not the object of the exercise, or to aggressively tear into the barrier. The general rule is this: good puzzles encourage the dog to use his nose persistently and forcefully to penetrate past and contact the hide, but without greatly increasing his tendency to scratch or bite at the hide. As we saw with the introduction of the aggressive response dog to vehicles, the trainer has a number of different options when choosing the type of hide or target for the dog. The trainer can place an open trap in order to minimize handler involvement and increase the dog's independence and obedience to odor. The trainer can also use open hides and partially blocked hides. These methods still allow the dog to employ the oral response, forcing the handler to deliver the reward. Finally, the handler can use a blocked hide, in which the dog's only option is the final response. Because the use of a trap and self-reward are not available with the passive response dog, we have a simplified picture. Early in the introduction to vehicles, the dog will encounter only open hides. These hides will allow the dog to make the contact response, and then he will be rewarded from hand. Later, Randy will introduce partially blocked hides. When the dog finds a partially blocked hide, he should exhibit a strong alert and then a lengthy period of investigating and localizing as he tries to find a way past the barrier to make the contact response. Eventually, he will have to settle for a final response, repeatedly contacting or acknowledging the vehicle body at the point of greatest odor concentration. Then the handler will reward him by opening access to the hide. The dog will make the contact response, and then he is rewarded from hand. Open hides and partially blocked hides will comprise fully 80% of the dog's fines. More than 3/4 of the time, he will earn reward by making contact with the hide. Only one time in 4 or 5 searches will the dog earn reward through the final response alone. The passive detector dog is introduced to building searches and learns to work on leash under his handler's direction in just the same way as the aggressive dog. The only important distinction between the two training methods has to do with the final form of the passive final response. When, for some administrative reason, it is necessary to teach the passive response dog to assume a sit when making the final response, Randy teaches the sit during these final stages of training. Randy teaches the sit so late because it is a behavior that the dog has practiced all his life in order to achieve reward. He has sat to receive his food, sat to be allowed out of the kennel. Because of all of this practice, the dog's threshold for sit is very, very low. He need only to be confronted with a reward held above head height, and more than likely he will sit. Randy's entire purpose has been to ingrain in the dog a deeply rooted habit of pinpointing the hide and making contact with it in order to earn reward. Only when this localization and contact behavior are very, very strong, only when they have achieved primacy over any other response tendency does Randy reintroduce the sit. With the dog possessing a substantial aggressive response tendency, meaning that when frustrated he may begin to aggress the hide, Randy introduces the sit with a high hide. The hide is always an open one to give the dog a visible fixation point to hold him steady while the handler manipulates his behavior. The dog is allowed to find the hide, and then while he executes his contact response, the handler gives the command to sit. If the dog sits and looks at the handler, then he is ignored until he reestablishes focus on the hide. The first few repetitions, the dog is rewarded while he is in the sit position. From this point on, he is rewarded about 50% of the time while in the sit, and about 50% of the time when he rears out of the sit to make contact or close acknowledgement.
During the passive response, we don't exactly want our dogs to perform what we would call the oral game. But there's nothing wrong with the dog reaching up there and touching it with his nose or just acknowledging it, whether it's just a head movement or a head poke to acknowledge, hey, there it is, there it is, there it is. And as we reinforce them for doing that particular response and reinforce them for doing the passive response, you'll see those two behaviors start to come together as one. Then you see the dog sitting and nose poking at the same time, nose poking. The difference is he's right on target. And if he's right on target, we're going to fulfill our end of the contract, and that is to deliver the reward at the point of odor.
With a less aggressive dog, Randy is free to employ a hide at head height or slightly higher. If the animal has a habit of backing away from the hide before sitting, then initially Randy will not make an issue of this behavior. He will first establish the sit, and then later he will begin withholding reward until the dog scoots forward a little closer to the aid. The dog, who has the knack of maintaining steady contact with the hide, makes matters easy in some ways because he can be rewarded for both the sit and contact at the same time. However, sometimes this dog can be difficult because there is a substantial component of freezing in this behavior. He may be unresponsive to the voice command to sit. In this circumstance, it is permissible to help the dog by lightly encouraging him into a sitting position. With very low hides, the passive trained dog normally lies down rather than sitting, and in Randy's opinion, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this. The dog's priority should be approaching the hide as closely as possible, and if the down brings him closer than the sit, then this is all for the best. This concludes our presentation of the hair method for training substance detector dogs. We hope that these videos have made it clear to the viewer what a revelation the hair method is, what a paradigm shift it represents away from the traditional methods of training. We hope that we have conveyed the richness and subtlety of the theory behind the method and convinced the viewer of the power and precision that can be developed in the substance detector dog by giving him a truly clear understanding of his task. If the hair method can be said to have a disadvantage, it is that the method is so revolutionary and so exacting in its design. That is, each component of the hair method is fully thought out, and it is dependent for its full effect on the other components. Together, all the parts of the method function as a tightly integrated whole. As a result, it is very difficult to take from Randy Hair one or two good ideas and incorporate them usefully into a traditional system. In order to realize the extraordinary power of Randy's theory and techniques, one must be willing to drop one's habitual patterns of thinking and adopt the hair method as a whole. After witnessing the remarkable performances of the dogs shown in these videos, we hope that you are convinced by results and that you will muster the nerve to train your next dog in a completely new way. We invite you to move to the leading edge of detector dog theory and technique and get on target with Randy Hair.
Canine Training Systems is the trendsetter in canine performance video and brings you the most up-to-date techniques in training and breed-related videos, books, and training aids. Please visit our website at www.caninetrainingsystems.com